Welcome back to Bytes, where we uncover the most fascinating and complex lives in history. Today, we're delving into the life of a man whose journey from rural obscurity to global infamy is as shocking as it is compelling. To some, he was a ruthless kingpin, to others a hero of the people, and to Colombia, a figure who left a lasting legacy of both violence and intrigue. This is the story of Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. The story of Pablo Escobar begins on December 1st, 1949, in the small agricultural town of Rionegro in Antioquia, Colombia. Imagine this rural town, its dirt roads winding through vast green hillsides, humble cottages dotting the landscape, and families working long hours in the fields under the sun. Life in Rionegro was simple but harsh, a place where the daily grind of farm work kept most families grounded in poverty. Pablo was born into a struggling family. His father, Abel de Jesus Dari Escobar Echeverri, worked as a poor farmer, a campesino, who labored on small parcels of land, often barely earning enough to keep food on the table. Pablo's mother, Hermilda de los Dolores Gaviria Berrio, was a school teacher who believed fiercely in education, hoping that her children's learning would one day help them escape the rural life and its limitations. Together, Abel and Hermilda brought up 7 children, of whom Pablo was the third. For Abel, the long hours in the fields and the low earnings created a life of constant strain, and despite Hermilda's income as a teacher, the family's finances remained dire. Early on, young Pablo observed the contrast between his parents' work and the rewards they received. His father's laborious work in the fields brought little security, while his mother's teaching offered a modest income but no escape from poverty. Yet for Pablo, his mother's school teaching was a symbol of resilience, a way to rise above their circumstances, even if he would one day choose a far different path to gain power and influence. When Pablo was still a young boy, his family moved to Medellín, one of Colombia's fastest-growing cities. This move, as it would turn out, set the stage for the man he would become. Medellín was vastly different from the quiet, agrarian life of Rionegro. Picture the bustling streets, the constant hum of factories, and the rapid construction as the city expanded. Medellín was transforming into Colombia's industrial center, a place of opportunity but also of hardship and struggle. For Pablo, the move to Medellín was eye-opening. Here was a place where wealth and poverty lived side by side, where luxurious buildings overlooked cramped slums. His family settled in a modest neighborhood on the city's outskirts, where Pablo could witness Medellín's extremes up close. Living in a poor neighborhood with few opportunities, he absorbed the resilience and determination of Medellín's residents, many of whom were working multiple jobs just to survive. Medellín, for him, represented both opportunity and disparity, a city that rewarded those who knew how to seize power and wealth by any means necessary. By the 1950s and 60s, Medellín was at the heart of Colombia's transformation. The city had humble beginnings, having started as a settlement for Spanish colonizers in the Aburrá Valley near the Andes Mountains. Over time, it grew from a small village to a regional hub, and eventually to Colombia's industrial capital, a place where opportunity and ambition thrived. Medellín's story was one of rapid growth and change, and it reflected the same relentless drive that would characterize Pablo's ambitions. Imagine Medellín in those years. Growing up in Medellín, young Pablo was a restless and curious child, often brimming with ambition but quick to notice the privileges others enjoyed. School didn't hold his attention for long, and by his early teens, he was finding ways to make money outside the classroom. He observed that in Medellín, those who found success often did so through unconventional means, and he quickly set his sights on doing the same. By age 14, Pablo had begun hanging around local street gangs. He and his friends started with small acts of mischief, but it didn't take long for these small-time pranks to escalate into something more serious. One of the stories from this period is when he supposedly tried his hand at a local scheme involving gravestones. The tale goes that he would take gravestones, sand down the names, and sell them to unsuspecting buyers, a bizarre early hustle that hints at his unrelenting focus on profit, even if the story's truth is sometimes debated. Pablo's behavior grew bolder as he realized his skill for intimidation and manipulation. He quickly learned that with the right threats, doors would open for him. At one point, during an argument with another young man named Julio Gaviria, Pablo pulled out a gun, and shot him in the foot, marking his first violent crime. It was a turning point for him. Pablo spent his first nights in jail for the incident, and although it was a brief stay, it offered a glimpse into a life he would soon embrace fully. As Pablo matured, the petty crimes turned into more ambitious schemes. He moved into car theft, quickly gaining a reputation in Medellín's underworld. He didn't just steal cars, he learned how to make entire networks of stolen vehicles disappear, distributing them across the city with an efficiency that suggested a mind for strategy. Pablo's network grew, and so did his reputation. Soon he was dabbling in smuggling, taking advantage of Medellín's position as a regional trade hub. But what Pablo couldn't have known at the time was how the political situation in Colombia was shifting. Just a year before his birth in 1948, the country had entered one of its bloodiest periods, la violencia. This civil conflict, lasting nearly a decade, was marked by intense violence between the liberals and conservatives, two political factions fighting for power. Thousands died in the conflict, and Colombia was left divided, its institutions weakened and corrupt. When la violencia finally subsided in 1958, Colombia's government was in tatters, setting the stage for Pablo's rise. As Colombia tried to regain its footing, a new problem was taking root. The global demand for drugs, especially marijuana, was soaring in the 1960s, particularly in the United States. For Colombians, this demand represented opportunity. In Medellín, local smugglers began supplying marijuana to the American market, and they found that profits were enormous. By the early 1970s, Colombia's role in the global drug trade was expanding rapidly. For Pablo, whose smuggling activities were already bringing him into contact with this underworld, it was only a matter of time before he would set his sights on an even more lucrative product: cocaine. Cocaine was not yet the powerhouse industry it would become. In the 1970s, it was still a relatively niche drug used by elites in America's big cities. But as demand started growing, smugglers realized that cocaine had a far higher profit margin than marijuana. The challenge, however, was logistics. Cocaine needed to be transported from the coca plantations in Colombia's jungles, processed in secret labs, and then smuggled across borders. And this was where Escobar saw his true opportunity. In the mid-1970s, Escobar was introduced to the world of cocaine by Griselda Blanco, a notorious smuggler who saw his potential. He began delivering coca paste from the remote plantations to the labs in Medellín, getting a first-hand look at the cocaine trade. Soon, he would move beyond just delivering the raw material. He established his own network of labs and began developing a direct supply chain that would eventually stretch from the coca fields of Colombia to the nightlife-fueled streets of Miami. In 1976, while his cocaine empire was just starting to take shape, Pablo married Maria Victoria Henao. Maria was only 15, and she came from a family that saw potential in Pablo, despite his budding criminal reputation. For Pablo, marriage to Maria was part of an image he was crafting. He wasn't just a smuggler, he wanted to be seen as a family man, someone who provided for his loved ones and gave back to his community. It was an image that would serve him well in the years to come, as he cultivated a Robin Hood persona among the poor of Medellín. However, that same year, Pablo had his first serious brush with the law. In May 1976, he was caught transporting 18 kilograms of coca paste. Unlike his previous scrapes with the authorities, this was a major charge, one that could have ended his career before it truly began. But Escobar had already learned the power of bribery, an approach that would become one of his trademarks. First, he tried to bribe the arresting officers. When that didn't work, he moved up the chain, finding ways to manipulate the judicial process. Eventually, he succeeded in getting the charges dropped, and he walked free. This experience cemented Pablo's philosophy: plata o plomo, silver or lead. To him, every problem could be solved with either a bribe or a bullet, and he would use this strategy repeatedly to evade law enforcement, silence rivals, and secure his empire. With his newfound freedom and a ruthless approach to anyone who stood in his way, Escobar wasted no time in building his cocaine business into a full-scale cartel. With the lessons from his first major arrest still fresh in his mind, Pablo moved full speed into the cocaine business. In just a few years, he transitioned from small-scale smuggling to managing one of the world's largest and most profitable criminal empires. To reach this level, Escobar needed not only logistics and ruthlessness, but also strategy and innovation. He recognized that to move vast quantities of cocaine efficiently, he would need allies, secrecy, and infrastructure. So he brought a new level of sophistication to drug trafficking. In 1978, Pablo crossed paths with two people who would become instrumental in the cartel's rapid growth, Carlos Lader and George Jung. Lader, a German Colombian smuggler, had already been trafficking marijuana into the United States, and he brought with him both contacts and creative ideas about evading law enforcement. George Jung, an American with a background in marijuana smuggling, was well versed in getting products through U.S. borders and had connections in the American underworld. Together, these three men expanded the Medellín Cartel's reach in ways that were unprecedented. One of their most significant innovations was the use of Norman's Cay, a small island in the Bahamas, as a midway point between Colombia and the United States. Later, with Escobar's funding, transformed Norman's Cay into a fully equipped transshipment point. The island had everything a cartel could need: warehouses for storage, airstrips for landing, and even armed guards to protect against unwanted visitors. Massive shipments of cocaine would arrive on the island, where they were stored temporarily and then reloaded onto smaller aircraft. These smaller planes could evade American radar, slipping undetected into the southern U.S., especially into Florida. For a time, Norman's Cay was an untouchable fortress for Escobar and the cartel. It allowed them to expand their reach without drawing the immediate attention of authorities. But the success of this operation came with a new risk. The amount of money coming in was growing at an astonishing rate. By the early 1980s, the Medellín Cartel was earning millions of dollars every day. In a single week, they were making tens of millions. But even this kind of wealth presented problems. Moving, hiding, and laundering such enormous sums became a logistical nightmare. Escobar and his associates resorted to creative measures to manage their fortune. They hid cash in secret compartments in various properties, sometimes even building elaborate hideouts for cash within homes or warehouses. Legend has it that some houses had retractable jacuzzis, under which millions of dollars were stashed. Other methods were more straightforward. The cartel's operatives would bury stacks of cash in rural fields, using locations that only the most trusted knew about. These money-stashing tactics were so extensive that estimates suggest as much as 10% of the cartel's earnings were lost each year due to rot, insects, or simply being forgotten. But hiding money wasn't enough for Escobar. He wanted to secure his influence within Colombia and protect himself from extradition to the United States, a constant threat hanging over him as he rose in prominence. So, in the early 1980s, he began shaping a new public image. Pablo Escobar would no longer be just a drug lord. He would become a man of the people, a figure who supported and uplifted Medellín's poor and disenfranchised. He poured millions into social projects around the city, funding soccer fields, parks, and community centers. To many in Medellín, he became a hero, a man who cared about their hardships in a way the distant government in Bogotá did not. One of his most ambitious philanthropic projects was the development of Barrio Escobar, a housing initiative for the poor. Escobar saw the potential in winning public support, and he carefully cultivated his image as a benevolent Robin Hood figure. To families without homes, he gave fully built houses. To struggling neighborhoods, he delivered necessities and even distributed cash. His charity won him a level of loyalty from Medellín's lower class that would serve as a shield in the years to come. When law enforcement came looking, Escobar had entire neighborhoods ready to hide him, tip him off, or even protect him with their lives. But while Escobar was cementing his local power in Colombia, the international threat of extradition loomed ever larger. In 1982, Colombia signed an extradition treaty with the United States, allowing the Colombian government to send its citizens to the U.S. to stand trial for drug crimes. For Escobar, extradition was a fate worse than death. It meant facing the full weight of the American justice system, beyond the reach of his bribes and threats. So he devised a new plan, one that was as bold as it was audacious. He would enter politics. Escobar saw politics as the ultimate safeguard. If he could gain enough power and influence within Colombia's political structure, he might be able to control or repeal the extradition treaty. He aligned himself with the Liberal Party, a faction traditionally opposed to the conservative elites, who were often allied with American interests. Escobar's slogan was simple but effective: Colombia should not bow to the United States. He gained popularity in rural and working-class areas, positioning himself as a nationalist who would defend Colombia's sovereignty from outside influence. And in 1982, Escobar won a seat in the Colombian Chamber of Representatives. For a brief moment, it seemed his plan might work. He gained legitimacy as a politician and used his new position to argue against the extradition treaty. However, his newfound status also brought increased scrutiny. For years, Escobar had operated largely in the shadows, with rumors and whispers following him. But now, as a public figure, the media, political opponents, and law enforcement agencies began investigating him in earnest. This exposure proved to be a double-edged sword. His opponents, particularly members of the conservative establishment, saw Escobar as a direct threat to their power and to Colombia's relationship with the United States. Within months, a media campaign was launched against him. The newspaper El Espectador, known for its fearless reporting, published a story detailing Escobar's criminal past, including the 1976 arrest for cocaine trafficking that he had managed to cover up. The story was a blow to his public image and provided ammunition for his political rivals. Faced with mounting pressure, Escobar decided to withdraw from the public eye. In 1983, he resigned his seat in the Chamber of Representatives, but his departure from politics didn't end the controversy. Instead, it marked a turning point in his approach to power. If he couldn't change the system from within, he would do so from outside, by force, if necessary. The next phase of Escobar's life would see him shift from a public figure to a man at war with the Colombian state itself, setting off a wave of violence and terror that would define the nation for years to come. In 1984, with his political aspirations thwarted, Escobar's response was swift and brutal. He no longer sought acceptance or legitimacy. Instead, he began a relentless campaign against the Colombian state itself, starting with the man he saw as his biggest enemy, Colombia's Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla. Bonilla had publicly criticized Escobar, calling him out as a drug trafficker and shining a light on the Medellín Cartel's activities. To Pablo, this wasn't just an insult. It was a threat that could unravel his entire empire. On April 30th, 1984, Bonilla was assassinated in broad daylight. Hitmen on motorcycles pulled alongside his car in Bogotá traffic and opened fire with a submachine gun, killing him instantly. The murder shocked Colombia and was seen as a clear signal. Escobar was no longer trying to work within the system. He was willing to destroy it. The Colombian government's response to Bonilla's assassination was swift and harsh. Under immense public and political pressure, President Belisario Betancourt reactivated the extradition treaty with the United States. For Escobar, the revival of extradition marked an existential threat. In his mind, Colombian prison could be endured, but American prison was a nightmare, a place where his power, influence, and billions of dollars would mean nothing. With extradition now a terrifying reality, Escobar declared a new motto for himself and his cartel: Plata o plomo, silver or lead. It was a simple concept: cooperate and accept his bribe, or refuse and face a hail of bullets. This was no idle threat. Escobar systematically targeted judges, police officers, journalists, and politicians who supported extradition. Colombia was gripped by a reign of terror as Escobar and his cartel resorted to bombings, assassinations, and bribes, all aimed at destabilizing the government. Pablo's war against extradition was waged on many fronts, but it was most chillingly illustrated in his alliances with various guerrilla groups. One of the most infamous of these groups was the M19, a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla organization known for its audacious attacks on Colombia's political and military establishments. The M19 fighters shared Escobar's hatred for the conservative elites and were equally opposed to Colombia's growing dependence on the United States. By funding the M19, Escobar had created a powerful proxy that could target the Colombian government with an ideological backing he lacked. Then, on November 6, 1985, a turning point came when M19 launched a violent attack on the Palace of Justice, Colombia's Supreme Court building, located in the heart of Bogotá. Nearly 40 M19 guerrillas stormed the building, taking hundreds of hostages, including the country's most senior judges. Their demands included the immediate suspension of the extradition treaty and the removal of Colombia's top political figures. With Escobar's financial backing, M19 was bold enough to face down the Colombian government directly. As the siege unfolded, the government found itself trapped in a brutal stalemate. After several failed attempts at negotiation, the military ultimately stormed the palace in an aggressive rescue operation. The ensuing violence was catastrophic. Fires broke out, likely triggered by explosions used to break into the building, and by the end of the siege, over 100 people lay dead, including half of the country's Supreme Court justices. The attack on the Palace of Justice was a traumatic event for Colombia, and while the government regained control of the building, it came at an enormous cost. The assault destroyed court records and crucial documents, including many files detailing drug trafficking cases. Some speculated that the destruction was deliberate, part of Escobar's strategy to erase evidence against him and his associates. To this day, however, it remains unclear whether the files were deliberately destroyed by M19 fighters to help Escobar or simply lost in the chaos of the siege. Whatever the intention, the outcome favored Escobar. The Palace of Justice siege was both a psychological and symbolic blow to the Colombian government, weakening its position in the public eye and providing Escobar with temporary respite from legal scrutiny. But it also marked a shift in the government's approach. President Betancourt, deeply affected by the loss of life and the destruction of the country's highest court, committed himself to an all-out war against Escobar and the cartels. Escobar, meanwhile, was undeterred. To him, the siege on the Palace of Justice was proof that the Colombian government could be pushed to its limits, and he continued to ramp up his efforts to avoid extradition. He saw Colombia's shifting political landscape as an opportunity, and was relentless in his pursuit of allies who would help him undermine any pro-extradition efforts. As Colombia descended deeper into violence, the country's next presidential race loomed, set for 1990. Escobar and the Medellín Cartel had identified their primary adversary, Luis Carlos Galán, a presidential candidate who had built his campaign on a tough stance against the cartels. Galán was young, charismatic, and popular, with a platform dedicated to reforming Colombia and ridding it of cartel influence. For Escobar, Galán represented an existential threat, a politician who might not be swayed by threats or bribes. So Escobar turned to his tried-and-tested tactic: elimination. On August 18, 1989, as Galán addressed supporters at a political rally in the town of Soacha, he was gunned down by Escobar's assassins, his dreams of reform and justice brutally cut short. The assassination of Galán shocked the nation and drove home the reality of the violence tearing Colombia apart. With each attack, Escobar was cementing his reputation as the most dangerous man in Colombia, a figure who had transcended the criminal underworld and was now terrorizing the state itself. In response, the government intensified its efforts to combat Escobar. The Colombian National Police, under pressure from both the public and the United States, created a specialized unit known as Search Block to capture Escobar and his associates. Backed by resources from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and the CIA, Search Block would focus all its energy and resources on taking down the Medellín Cartel once and for all. And with the assassination of Galán, Colombia had reached a turning point. Escobar's reign was now not just a criminal problem, but a national crisis. With the creation of Search Block, a dedicated unit of Colombia's most elite officers began relentlessly hunting down cartel members. Escobar responded by waging a brutal campaign of reprisal, killing police officers, bombing government buildings, and turning the streets of Medellín into a war zone. He placed bounties on the heads of officers, offering substantial rewards to anyone who killed a member of Search Block. Medellín, once known for its industrious growth and promise, became the most violent city in the world, with hundreds of homicides every month as Escobar's war with the Colombian government escalated. This battle was about more than escaping justice. It was a battle for control, for legacy, and for Escobar, a battle for survival. Every day he watched as the walls closed in, his organization chipped away by a relentless government apparatus that wouldn't rest until he was either behind bars or dead. The Colombian government had made it clear Escobar's time was running out, and in his last stand, he would throw every weapon he had against a country determined to break free from his grip. As Escobar's war with the Colombian government raged on, his ruthless tactics began to backfire. By the late 1980s, the violence had reached unprecedented levels, staining even his public image in Medellín, where he had once been revered as a modern-day Robin Hood. Daily bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations left ordinary citizens living in terror. Families avoided the streets at night, businesses closed early, and Medellín had become a city under siege. By 1989, Escobar's influence had grown so pervasive that the Colombian government was nearly crippled. But with his unchecked power came a level of scrutiny and fear that Escobar himself hadn't anticipated. Realizing that his survival depended on stopping the government's relentless pursuit, he offered a deal. He would voluntarily go to prison in exchange for a promise that he would not be extradited to the United States. It was a bold move, but one that Escobar calculated could protect his empire and secure his personal safety. In 1991, the Colombian government, exhausted by the years of violence and pressure from the public, accepted the proposal with strict terms. But there was one surprising catch. Escobar would construct his own prison. It was to be called La Catedral, the cathedral, though it would be anything but a place of repentance. La Catedral was unlike any prison in the world. Built on a fog-covered hilltop outside Medellín, it featured everything Pablo needed to continue his empire comfortably and securely. The prison included a lavish Spanish-style mansion, complete with a jacuzzi, bar, and private nightclub, as well as a football field and a helipad. Escobar spared no expense in turning La Catedral into a fortress disguised as a detention center. It was surrounded by thick forests, protected by high walls, and patrolled by his own hand-picked guards, ensuring that nobody could reach him. To the outside world, Escobar's incarceration was a victory for the Colombian government. He was, technically, in prison, and on paper, it marked a win in the battle against the cartels. But in reality, La Catedral was a command center. Escobar continued to oversee his empire from within its walls, organizing shipments, communicating with his associates, and holding meetings with trusted allies. It was a clear demonstration of his unyielding influence, a fortress where he could evade true punishment, while maintaining control over his cartel's vast operations. However, Escobar's twisted version of imprisonment was beginning to wear thin with Colombian officials. Reports began to circulate that he was not only managing his business from within La Catedral, but also indulging in the lavish comforts of a life free from consequence. For ordinary Colombians, the hypocrisy was obvious. While they lived in fear of the Medellín Cartel's violence, their government's most wanted criminal was living in a self-styled palace on the taxpayer's dime. As pressure mounted, rumors emerged that Escobar was going beyond managing his cartel operations from La Catedral. Colombian officials grew increasingly suspicious that Escobar was using La Catedral as a base to carry out executions of rivals or associates who had crossed him. These suspicions were confirmed when two of his top lieutenants, Fernando Galeano and Gerardo Moncada, were found dead under mysterious circumstances. Both men had been invited to La Catedral to discuss business, but they never left. The government had no choice but to act. In July 1992, they announced plans to move Escobar to a traditional prison. This decision was the tipping point. Realizing he would soon be transferred to a facility beyond his control, Escobar launched an audacious escape plan that would once again defy the very law he'd pledged to obey. With stunning ease, Escobar slipped through La Catedral's defenses. The prison guards, many of whom were loyal to him rather than the government, offered little resistance. Hidden escape routes and tunnels allowed him to vanish from the facility, as if he had simply walked out the front door. By the time Colombian officials realized what had happened, Escobar was long gone, hiding out in one of his many safe houses spread across Medellín. Escobar's escape from La Catedral unleashed a new wave of chaos across Colombia. The government was humiliated. For years they had struggled to bring Escobar under control, and now, after agreeing to his terms, they found themselves once again in pursuit of the man who had turned Colombia into a battlefield. But this time, they had powerful allies. The United States had grown increasingly involved in Colombia's anti-narcotics efforts, dispatching DEA agents and U.S. military advisors to assist in the search for Escobar. In response, the Colombian government assembled Search Block, a specialized military and police task force with a singular mission: to capture or kill Pablo Escobar. Armed with advanced technology and a network of informants, Search Block would leave no stone unturned in their hunt. The U.S. government provided intelligence and equipment, ensuring that Colombia had the resources to find Escobar, even in the remotest regions of the country. With the noose tightening, Escobar's once loyal network began to unravel. The bounty on his head was substantial, and former allies, sensing that Escobar's reign was drawing to a close, saw an opportunity to save themselves or profit from his capture. One by one, his safe houses were raided, his contacts turned informants, and his hideouts dismantled. As Escobar moved from one safe house to the next, he began to feel the strain of a life constantly on the run. The luxuries he had once enjoyed were long gone, replaced by a paranoid vigilance that wore him down. His family had been relocated to safety, but for Escobar himself, every day was a struggle to stay ahead of his pursuers. Finally, after months of pursuit, Colombian authorities located him in a middle-class neighborhood in Medellín. The building was modest, a far cry from the opulence of La Catedral or Hacienda Nápoles. Yet even in hiding, Escobar could not resist keeping in contact with his family. His phone calls, meticulously traced by Colombian intelligence, provided the clues Search Block needed to close in. On December 2, 1993, Colombian forces surrounded Escobar's final safe house. Escobar, realizing he was cornered, attempted one last, desperate escape. Alongside his bodyguard, he fled onto the rooftop, darting across neighboring buildings in a futile effort to evade capture. Shots rang out, and moments later, the man who had once ruled Colombia's underworld lay dead. His body sprawled across the rooftop, a bullet wound in his ear marking the end of his reign. For Colombia, Escobar's death was a moment of bittersweet triumph. The man who had terrorized a nation, whose wealth and violence had made him nearly untouchable, was finally brought down. Medellín began to rebuild itself, its streets slowly recovering from years of cartel violence. But the legacy of Pablo Escobar would not be erased so easily. His life and death had reshaped Colombia, leaving scars that would take generations to heal. Even in death, Escobar's influence lingered. To some, he remained a hero, a man who had defied authority, a figure who had built hospitals, schools, and housing for the poor in his home city. To others, he was a symbol of unbridled ambition and ruthless violence. His story, one of power, crime, and tragedy, remains one of the most complex and haunting in modern history. But ultimately, Pablo Escobar's legacy serves as a cautionary tale of the darkness that can arise when ambition overrides humanity, a reminder of the heavy cost Colombia paid during his rule, and of the resilience of a people who endured years of unimaginable violence and still dared to hope for a better future. After Escobar's death, the people of Medellín in Colombia experienced a complex blend of relief, grief, and the challenging process of rebuilding a society scarred by violence. Escobar's influence had penetrated nearly every layer of Colombian life, from the impoverished neighborhoods he sought to uplift, to the politicians, police, and judges he either corrupted or killed. But with his empire dismantled, Medellín entered a period of transition, one marked by tentative steps toward healing and an attempt to rebuild a city and a country that had been defined by narco-trafficking and terror for nearly 2 decades. In the immediate aftermath, the void left by Escobar's Medellín Cartel was filled by his former rivals, the Cali Cartel. Unlike Escobar's flashy public displays of wealth and power, the Cali Cartel operated more covertly, favoring discretion over violence. The Orihuela brothers, who led the Cali Cartel, chose to establish connections with business elites and focus on managing the cocaine trade with a business-like approach. They avoided high-profile bombings and assassinations, preferring bribes to bullets and leveraging a sophisticated intelligence network to evade capture. Yet, as much as the Cali Cartel tried to avoid Escobar's fate, it too was brought down by Colombian authorities with assistance from the U.S. government in the mid-1990s. This time, the Colombian government was better prepared to handle the fallout. A more organized, professionalized anti-narcotics force had emerged in Colombia, determined to keep the new wave of cartels from replicating the Medellín Cartel's brutal dominance. However, dismantling the major cartels did not bring an end to Colombia's challenges. In many ways, the fall of the Medellín and Cali cartels created a fragmented landscape of smaller, more unpredictable criminal organizations. With the decline of large syndicates, a series of smaller groups emerged, splintering into regional operations and ushering in the era of micro-cartels. These new groups lacked the centralized structure of Escobar's cartel, but were equally driven to exploit the drug trade's lucrative profits. Meanwhile, Medellín and Colombia struggled to rebuild an economy that had long been dependent on cocaine. Decades of narco-trafficking had devastated Colombia's legitimate industries, so much so that major agricultural and manufacturing sectors had withered in the shadow of the drug trade. Now, Colombia sought to rejuvenate its economy by focusing on legitimate exports, tourism, and education. In Medellín, this shift became a major part of the city's transformation. The urban landscape, once synonymous with violence and cartel control, underwent a series of groundbreaking reforms and developments in the years after Escobar's death. Public transit systems were expanded to connect isolated neighborhoods to the rest of the city, offering economic opportunities to areas once dominated by cartel influence. The construction of the Metro Cable, an innovative cable car system linking Medellín's hillside slums to the city center, symbolized a new era of connectivity and investment. Education was also prioritized in Medellín's post-Escobar rebuilding efforts. Schools and community centers sprang up, providing Medellín's youth with access to education, vocational training, and recreational activities. Public libraries were built in neighborhoods that had been cartel strongholds, symbolizing a new focus on knowledge and opportunity, rather than fear and violence. Local leaders hoped that these efforts would give future generations options beyond the path of the drug trade that had dominated their parents' lives. But for those who had lived through the Escobar era, moving on wasn't so simple. Many Colombians had grown up in a world where narco-trafficking was woven into the fabric of society. The allure of easy wealth and power through the drug trade didn't vanish overnight, even with Escobar gone. In Medellín's poorer neighborhoods where Escobar had built his support by investing in housing, healthcare, and schools, his legacy as a benefactor remained. To this day, some residents of Medellín, especially in the communities that benefited from his so-called charity, view Escobar with a certain degree of admiration. These conflicting perspectives on Escobar, as a villain or a hero, reflect the complexity of his impact on Colombia. For many who had experienced the brutal violence of the cartel wars firsthand, Escobar's actions were unforgivable. But for others, particularly those who had seen his philanthropy in action, He was a figure who provided opportunities in a world where the government had often failed to reach. Beyond Medellín, Colombia's government grappled with the task of preventing another figure like Escobar from ever rising to power again. Efforts to address the economic inequality that had driven many into the drug trade became a national priority. In the years following Escobar's death, Colombia received significant aid from the United States under Plan Colombia, an ambitious strategy to curb drug production, promote economic development, and strengthen Colombian institutions. Despite some controversy surrounding its military tactics, Plan Colombia made notable strides in reducing the influence of cartels and reintegrating remote regions into the country's economic and political systems. Meanwhile, as Colombia struggled with these changes, the international drug trade adapted to the changing dynamics of the region. With Colombian cartels in disarray, Mexican criminal organizations emerged as the primary distributors of cocaine into the United States. The Mexican cartels, led by figures like Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, began filling the vacuum left by Colombia's declining cartels. With Colombia's cocaine output still considerable, the Mexican cartels assumed the role of middlemen, trafficking Colombian cocaine northward in exchange for a substantial portion of the profits. In Colombia, the cultural legacy of Escobar's life became a subject of fascination and debate, both domestically and internationally. His life story inspired countless books, documentaries, and even a global television series, all of which sought to capture the enigma of a man who had single-handedly reshaped a country through fear, power, and an uncanny knack for building an empire out of violence. This fascination with Escobar is both a tribute to and a caution against his larger-than-life persona. His legacy endures in part because he was a figure of extreme contradictions, a man who built hospitals and bombed airplanes, a benefactor to the poor who was also the architect of an unprecedented wave of terror. For Colombia, grappling with Escobar's shadow is an ongoing process. While the country has moved beyond the worst days of the cartel wars, it still bears the weight of his memory. Ultimately, Escobar's life and death serve as a reminder of the costs of unchecked ambition and the tragic consequences of building wealth and power on the suffering of others. For Colombians, his story is both a historical cautionary tale and a motivator for creating a future free from the cycles of violence and corruption he embodied. In Medellín, where he once ruled with absolute authority, the transformation of neighborhoods, the construction of libraries and schools, and the gradual reduction in violence reflect a city determined to redefine itself. Today, Medellín stands as a testament to resilience, a city that survived one of the darkest chapters in its history and emerged with a newfound sense of purpose. The story of Pablo Escobar remains a potent symbol of how one man's choices can ripple across an entire nation. His legacy continues to challenge Colombia, but it also inspires a commitment to a future where the next generation grows up with role models who embody a different set of values. After Pablo Escobar's violent rise to power and his notorious years of running the Medellín Cartel, his influence extended beyond the underworld and deep into the roots of Colombia's society. His legacy was not only marked by fear and crime, but also an intricate mix of public adoration and deep societal divisions. Escobar's vast wealth allowed him to pour millions of dollars back into his hometown of Medellín, funding housing projects, soccer fields, and entire neighborhoods. For many in the city's impoverished communities, these developments provided a way out of poverty that the government had long failed to offer. Escobar's projects earned him the affectionate title of El Patrón, a title symbolizing not only the head of a cartel, but a man who, in many ways, embodied the promise of a better life for Medellín's marginalized citizens. This blend of fear and respect created a complex relationship between Escobar and the public. His narco-terrorism left thousands dead, yet some viewed him as a modern-day Robin Hood. He paid for medical clinics, built schools, and gave cash handouts during holidays, acts of goodwill that seemed almost unfathomable in a country torn by poverty and violence. This dual legacy left Colombians conflicted. They struggled with the violence he unleashed, yet some continued to mourn the death of the man who had, in their eyes, stood up to Colombia's corrupt elite. In time, Escobar's reputation as a man of the people reached unprecedented heights, largely through his connection with Medellin's most popular sport, soccer. Escobar invested heavily in Atlético Nacional, Medellin's beloved soccer team, showering the players with gifts, bonuses, and facilities that quickly transformed the team from local competitors to international champions. When Atlético Nacional won the Copa Libertadores in 1989, it marked a turning point, not only for the team but for Colombia's sense of national pride. But Escobar's grip on Colombia was far darker than any victory could illuminate. His charitable acts were a thin veil over a network that was wreaking havoc on the country. As his empire expanded, so did the scale of his violence. He eliminated anyone who stood in his way, from rival cartel members to police officers, journalists, and government officials who dared to challenge him. His involvement in local politics, too, took on an ominous tone, as he used his power to intimidate officials into overlooking his criminal activities or to bend legislation in his favor. When the Colombian government ramped up efforts to bring Escobar to justice, Escobar responded with brutal resolve. He orchestrated assassinations, kidnappings, and even mass bombings across Bogotá and Medellín. The most harrowing of these was the bombing of Avianca Flight 203, which killed over 100 passengers in an attempt to assassinate a single political figure. The calculated violent nature of these attacks shifted Escobar's public image further from a hero of the people to that of a ruthless warlord who would stop at nothing to protect his empire. The wave of terror unleashed by Escobar ultimately strained the very fabric of Colombian society. It was not only a fight between drug cartels and government forces, it was a campaign of intimidation, where Colombian citizens feared their own streets, markets, and schools. Every bombing and assassination tightened the hold of the cartels on Colombia, drowning the country in terror and mistrust. Escobar's infamous silver or lead motto, offering either a bribe or a bullet, left many Colombians with no choice but to comply. By the early 1990s, Medellín was no longer known as Colombia's second-largest city, but as the world's most dangerous city. The city's homicide rate was unmatched, with thousands falling victim to cartel-related violence. Children in Medellín grew up in a world where gunfire was a familiar sound, and fear was woven into the everyday fabric of life. Yet, even in this climate of dread, some still saw Escobar as a man who stood against an elite system that had long failed Colombia's poor. This ambivalence only fueled the international intrigue around Escobar's life and legacy. He was both a criminal mastermind and a folk hero, a paradox that would continue to haunt Colombia long after his death. As the violence in Colombia escalated, the country's government, heavily pressured by the United States, began taking more drastic measures to curb the growing power of Pablo Escobar and the Medellín Cartel. This turning point marked the beginning of an all-out war against the cartels, with Escobar's criminal empire in the government's crosshairs. Escobar understood the rising threat of extradition to the United States, which had become his greatest fear. Extradition to the U.S. meant life in a maximum security prison with no means of escape, a stark contrast to the bribbable and corruptible institutions within Colombia. Escobar's terror of extradition was so intense that he famously claimed, "I would rather have a grave in Colombia than a cell in the United States." Determined to avoid extradition at all costs, Escobar launched a ruthless campaign against any Colombian officials who dared support the extradition treaty with the U.S. politicians. Judges and police officers were either bribed or assassinated. In what was one of his most brutal moves, Escobar orchestrated the murder of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, the Colombian Minister of Justice, in 1984. This assassination served as a grim warning to any other officials who might challenge the power of the cartel. Following Bonilla's death, the Colombian government, under President Belisario Betancourt, declared an all-out war on Escobar and the Medellín Cartel. The government was determined to end the reign of narco-terrorism, that had plunged Colombia into chaos. By the late 1980s, Colombia's police force, military, and intelligence services were all mobilized to capture Escobar, working closely with U.S. agencies like the DEA and the CIA. This intensified international pressure only pushed Escobar to unleash a wave of terror on the Colombian state. In response to the government crackdown, Escobar's tactics became more violent and indiscriminate. His campaign, often called narco-terrorism, left Colombians living in constant fear. In addition to targeting government officials, Escobar began orchestrating large-scale bombings in public places. The most infamous of these was the bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in 1989. Intended to kill a single presidential candidate who had opposed Escobar, the attack killed over 100 innocent civilians. This horrifying event marked a shift in Escobar's public perception, both within Colombia and internationally. The Robin Hood image he had crafted began to erode, replaced by the portrait of a ruthless killer. These attacks culminated in the 1985 Palace of Justice siege, a defining moment in Colombia's war on the cartels. M-19 guerrilla fighters, believed to have been financially backed by Escobar, stormed the Palace of Justice in Bogotá, taking hundreds of hostages and demanding an end to the extradition policy. Colombian armed forces responded with overwhelming force, resulting in a bloody standoff that led to the deaths of nearly 100 people, including half of the country's Supreme Court judges. The attack left the Palace of Justice in ruins, along with much of the evidence that could have been used against Escobar and other high-profile cartel members. The siege underscored the cartel's power and ruthlessness, but it also exposed the fragility of the Colombian state. Escobar's war against the government had turned into a full-scale assault on Colombia's institutions. Schools, government offices, and media outlets were under siege, and judges, journalists, and police officers lived in constant fear of becoming Escobar's next target. To strengthen his grip, Escobar launched an extensive propaganda campaign to maintain his image as a champion of Colombia's poor. He doubled down on his Robin Hood narrative by funding housing projects and giving large sums of money to Medellín's poorest neighborhoods. During Christmas, Escobar would play the role of Santa Claus, handing out toys and cash to underprivileged children, a spectacle that brought hundreds to his estate, the Hacienda Nápoles. The people who benefited from Escobar's generosity continued to see him as a hero, even as the violence escalated around them. His support for Medellín's soccer team, Atlético Nacional, only added to his local influence. In 1989, Atlético Nacional became the first Colombian team to win the prestigious Copa Libertadores. For Escobar, this victory was more than just a win on the soccer field. It symbolized the success and pride of Medellín, reinforcing his connection with the city and its people. Despite his philanthropy, Escobar's public image was rapidly deteriorating. His violent tactics had turned Medellín into one of the most dangerous cities in the world, with homicide rates skyrocketing. Families lived in fear, with gunfire and bombings becoming regular parts of life. By 1991, Medellín's murder rate was so high that it was considered the world's most violent city. Escobar's so-called empire was drowning Medellín in blood. As Colombia continued to suffer, Escobar's influence extended into every level of society. Government officials, police officers, and even local journalists lived under the constant shadow of cartel violence. Many who tried to expose Escobar's operations or oppose his agenda were met with swift and brutal retribution. Yet, even as Escobar's reign of terror persisted, he was preparing for a shocking negotiation with the Colombian government. Escobar understood that his empire was under siege and that the government, with U.S. support, was closing in. So, in 1991, he made a controversial proposition to Colombian authorities. He would surrender if he were guaranteed that he wouldn't face extradition to the United States. To the astonishment of many, the Colombian government agreed to the deal, but the terms of Escobar's surrender were unlike anything ever seen in Colombia, or perhaps anywhere. In a highly unusual agreement, Escobar would serve his prison sentence in a custom-built facility of his own design, known as La Catedral, or the Cathedral. This arrangement, however, would prove to be a Faustian bargain for the Colombian government, as Escobar's control over his empire from within La Catedral became a new chapter in his story, a chapter that revealed the true extent of his reach, influence, and audacity. With his surrender in 1991, Escobar's transition to life in La Catedral was unlike anything Colombia or the world had ever seen. Despite being a prisoner, Escobar wielded an astonishing amount of control over his environment and activities. Built on a hilltop overlooking Medellín, La Catedral was less a prison and more of a fortress. Complete with a soccer field, jacuzzi, and a sprawling estate, it provided Escobar with all the comforts of his previous life, while granting him a safe haven against his enemies, and even the state. Here, Escobar continued to hold court, directing the Medellín Cartel's operations from what was, in effect, a safe house. As bizarre as it seemed, La Catedral also highlighted the extent of Escobar's reach and the weaknesses within the Colombian government. Escobar had struck a deal that, while appeasing public demands for justice, did little to restrict his activities. The prison guards were hand-picked by him, and the walls served more to protect him from rival cartels and potential assassination attempts than to confine him. La Catedral was a symbol of Escobar's influence, a structure that effectively declared that the state couldn't hold him within the confines of a conventional prison. For a time, it seemed Escobar had pulled off the impossible. From within La Catedral, he continued to live lavishly and orchestrate the cartel's operations. He hosted parties, received guests, and conducted business as usual. The cartel's flow of cocaine into the U.S. continued largely uninterrupted, and Escobar reportedly hosted visits from high-profile individuals who came seeking his advice or patronage. Even Colombian officials found it difficult to deny the reality. Escobar was as powerful inside La Catedral as he had been outside. However, cracks in the arrangement soon began to appear. Rumors circulated that La Catedral was more than just a base of operations. It was a site for Escobar's continuing criminal enterprises. Stories emerged of cartel executions conducted within the prison walls. Cartel members who had fallen out of favor reportedly met grisly ends inside, and the authorities turned a blind eye, either out of fear or because of bribes. The gruesome details tarnished whatever legitimacy the government's deal with Escobar may have had. The arrangement began to look less like justice and more like a farce, with Escobar flaunting his ability to operate without consequence. Eventually, public outrage grew too loud to ignore. The Colombian government, already under international pressure, began to acknowledge that the situation at La Catedral had spiraled out of control. Escobar's reputation as a ruthless leader was only reinforced by reports of violence within the prison, and his influence was proving uncontainable even within the walls of his self-designed fortress. The Colombian government decided to take action. Escobar would be moved to a more secure facility, and La Catedral would be shut down. But Escobar was not about to let the government break their agreement so easily. In July 1992, he received word of the impending transfer, giving him time to prepare. Anticipating this move, Escobar had built a hidden escape route into La Catedral's structure. With a network of loyal guards and associates, he used this escape plan to slip out of the prison, vanishing into the Colombian landscape. This daring escape set off a nationwide manhunt that would become one of the most intense and highly publicized chases in modern history. President Cesar Gaviria, who had been humiliated by Escobar's surrender, turning into an extended farce, was now determined to bring him to justice once and for all. With the backing of U.S. agencies, a coalition of Colombian and American forces, including the DEA, CIA, and a specialized police unit known as the Search Block, launched a relentless pursuit to track down and capture the elusive kingpin. The United States, eager to put an end to the massive cocaine pipeline into its cities, provided high-tech resources, military intelligence, and advisory teams to the Colombian forces. The Search Block, a unit specifically tasked with hunting Escobar, was given extensive support, and American operatives were stationed on the ground, collaborating with the Colombian military and law enforcement. Adding fuel to the fire, Los Pepes, a vigilante group formed by some of Escobar's most embittered enemies, emerged as a ruthless force in the hunt. Made up of individuals who had suffered at the hands of the Medellín Cartel, Los Pepes waged a brutal campaign against Escobar's associates, his family members, and anyone else who had aided him over the years. Their violent tactics matched Escobar's own, and their vendetta created an atmosphere of absolute chaos, with the group reportedly coordinating with Search Block in their pursuit of the cartel's remnants. During his months on the run, Escobar was forced to adapt to a life of constant evasion. Gone were the luxuries of La Catedral and Hacienda Napol. Instead, he moved from one safe house to another, relying on a dwindling number of trusted allies and family members for protection and supplies. Living under extreme paranoia, Escobar rarely stayed in one place for long, and his network of safe houses across Medellín was constantly in flux as the Search Block tightened its net. Yet, even under these circumstances, Escobar was defiant. He managed to make occasional phone calls to his family and associates, each one a calculated risk as Colombian and U.S. forces were monitoring the airwaves for any trace of his location. On one occasion, he called a local radio station, taunting his pursuers and claiming he would never be taken alive. His confidence may have been shaken, but his resolve remained intact. As the manhunt intensified, the net around Escobar began to tighten. The Search Block's intelligence and surveillance efforts started yielding results, and they came agonizingly close to capturing him on several occasions. Each near miss only added to the pressure on Escobar, who began to exhaust his resources and allies as the months dragged on. Betrayals became commonplace, as even his once loyal supporters began to see his downfall as inevitable. The once mighty king of cocaine was now a fugitive, running from a coalition of the world's most powerful intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Finally, on December 2, 1993, after 16 months of evading capture, the endgame unfolded in a modest house in Medellín. Colombian intelligence had pinpointed a cell phone signal linked to Escobar's location, and the Search Block, along with American advisors, quickly mobilized. The house was surrounded, and Escobar's attempt to flee onto the rooftop led to a brief but intense standoff. In those final moments, the man who had once ruled over a global cocaine empire met his end in a hail of gunfire. Some accounts suggest that Escobar may have chosen to end his own life, delivering a fatal shot to avoid the disgrace of capture. Others insist that it was a Search Block officer who fired the shot that ended his life. In Medellín, thousands attended Escobar's funeral, many mourning the man they saw as a benefactor, while others celebrated the end of an era defined by fear and violence. With Escobar's death, the Colombian underworld was plunged into turmoil. For nearly 2 decades, Escobar had dominated the cocaine trade and shaped Medellín into the epicenter of a global drug empire. Now, with El Patron gone, rival cartels scrambled to claim what was left of the Medellín Cartel's territory, sparking a new wave of violence. Key among these rivals was the Cali Cartel, which quickly moved to secure its dominance over the cocaine trade, taking advantage of the Medellín Cartel's disarray. The Cali Cartel had always differed in style and strategy from Escobar's Medellín operation. Where Escobar ruled with bombings, assassinations, and open warfare, the Cali Cartel was quieter and more sophisticated, using bribery and diplomacy to infiltrate government institutions and gain influence. In Colombia, Escobar's death marked a turning point. The government, in collaboration with U.S. agencies, continued to clamp down on the remaining cartel factions, but the country's social and political landscape remained scarred. The legacy of violence and instability that had erupted during Escobar's reign had left deep wounds. Medellín, once synonymous with Escobar's brand of terror, began a slow, arduous process of recovery. Throughout the 1990s, Medellín saw an increase in government and international investment aimed at reshaping the city's infrastructure, improving education, and providing opportunities for youth who had once been drawn to cartel life. Public transportation systems, including the iconic cable car network, were expanded, providing low-income communities in the hills surrounding the city with better access to the urban center. With these changes, the city gradually transformed, moving away from its association with the world of narco-trafficking. One of the most visible remnants of Escobar's influence was the infamous Hacienda Nápoles, his vast estate that symbolized his wealth and power. After his death, the government seized the property, and the once lavish estate fell into disrepair. Yet it too would undergo a transformation in the years to come. Today, the site has been converted into a theme park, complete with a water park, zoo, and wildlife sanctuary. The hippos that Escobar had once imported continued to thrive, expanding into nearby areas and even disrupting local ecosystems. These cocaine hippos remain a peculiar living symbol of Escobar's excess and the unintended consequences of his influence. For his family, Escobar's death brought a complex legacy. His wife, Maria Victoria, and his 2 children initially fled Colombia, seeking refuge in various countries, including Mozambique and Argentina. However, they were far from free of the shadow cast by Pablo's life. In Argentina, his son, who had changed his name to Sebastián Marroquín, would eventually break his silence, publishing a memoir that aimed to reconcile the contradictory images of his father as both a caring family man and a ruthless criminal. Marroquín's story reflects the conflicted legacy left to those who knew Escobar personally, a reminder that even in death, Escobar's impact was deeply personal for many. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of Escobar's actions on Colombian society lingered. Even as Medellín and Colombia as a whole worked to rebuild, the violence and instability of Escobar's era continued to influence the country's criminal underworld. Smaller cartels rose to prominence, adapting to the pressures of law enforcement and taking a more covert approach than the Medellín Cartel's brash, confrontational style. Some of these factions evolved into highly organized criminal networks that diversified beyond drugs, venturing into other illegal activities such as human trafficking, illegal mining, and extortion. Colombian authorities, along with international partners, faced the ongoing challenge of dismantling these sophisticated organizations while dealing with the social conditions that allowed them to thrive. The United States' role in the Colombian drug conflict also evolved. In the years following Escobar's death, American military and financial aid to Colombia increased under programs like Plan Colombia, a multi-billion-dollar initiative launched in the late 1990s, with the goal of reducing the cocaine trade and strengthening Colombian institutions. The initiative saw some success in targeting coca production and funding counterinsurgency efforts. However, it also faced criticism for its environmental impact and for failing to address the root causes of the drug trade, including poverty and lack of opportunity in rural areas. The impact of Escobar's era extended beyond Colombia's borders. His operations had set a precedent for the global narcotics trade, influencing traffickers from Mexico to Europe. By the mid-1990s, Mexican cartels had become major players in the cocaine trade, taking over the transportation routes that Escobar had once dominated. The methods Escobar pioneered, using violence as a means of control, establishing deep-rooted connections with corrupt officials, and building complex international distribution networks, became a model for the Mexican cartels that would soon rise to global prominence. Today, the Mexican drug cartels wield immense power, and their influence on the narcotics trade can, in many ways, be traced back to the methods and strategies that Escobar and his associates developed in Colombia. In the broader cultural sphere, Escobar's story has been immortalized in countless books, films, and television shows. His larger-than-life persona, a complex mixture of ruthless ambition and populist appeal, has fascinated audiences worldwide. Productions like Narcos, which chronicled his rise and fall, have both entertained and informed, but they've also faced criticism for glamorizing his life and reign of terror. Escobar's life became a modern-day cautionary tale, an extreme example of how power, wealth, and corruption can destabilize entire nations, Escobar's legacy is a complex one. For some, he remains a folk hero, a man who gave back to the poor while standing up against perceived American imperialism. For others, he is a symbol of brutality and greed, a man whose ambitions brought unimaginable suffering. His story serves as a reminder of the human cost of the drug trade, a trade driven by insatiable demand, devastating poverty, and the allure of quick wealth. Today, Medellín is a city transformed, a place where public parks, libraries, and universities now occupy neighborhoods that were once controlled by Escobar's cartel. It has become a global model for urban innovation and social reform, a testament to the resilience of a community that has emerged from one of the darkest chapters in its history. But the scars left by Escobar's reign remain, visible in the collective memory of a nation that was irrevocably shaped by one man's drive for power. Though Escobar's life had ended, his legacy cast a long, dark shadow over Colombia and the world. His brutal tactics and unrelenting ambition forever changed the drug trade, law enforcement, and even the culture of violence in South America. Escobar's rise and fall stand as an enduring lesson on the cost of power at any price and the consequences of a criminal empire. Escobar's infamous Medellín Cartel fractured after his death, splintering into smaller factions that each fought to seize what they could of his crumbling empire. Although some parts of the organization were immediately dismantled, the void Escobar left behind didn't take long to fill. In the years that followed, rival cartels, especially the Cali Cartel and eventually Mexico's Sinaloa Cartel, rushed in, each using their own methods to capture a share of the profitable cocaine routes that led to North America, Europe, and beyond. These syndicates learned from Escobar's mistakes, refining their operations to avoid his high-profile, antagonistic approach to leadership, yet they adopted many of his strategies to solidify their own power. Following Escobar's death, the government had a unique opportunity to begin rebuilding Medellín and its surrounding areas. Colombian officials recognized the urgent need for reform, knowing they had to act quickly if they wanted to prevent another kingpin from rising in Escobar's place. Working with international partners and backed by U.S. assistance through initiatives like Plan Colombia, a long-term strategy was implemented to improve infrastructure, reduce poverty, and create legitimate economic opportunities for those who might otherwise be drawn to the drug trade. Medellín underwent a dramatic transformation over the years. The government and local leaders invested in the city's public transportation system, creating what is now a world-renowned network of metro lines, cable cars, and bus routes that connect the city's poorest communities to its commercial and cultural centers. Libraries, schools, and parks were built in neighborhoods that had once been under the tight grip of cartel violence, giving citizens a reason to take pride in their communities. As Medellín evolved, so did the nation's approach to law enforcement, with a greater emphasis on intelligence sharing, targeted operations, and a commitment to reducing corruption within Colombia's police and judiciary. The shift was not without setbacks. The country still faces violence and instability in some regions, with certain areas remaining under the influence of smaller, fragmented cartels and paramilitary groups. The cocaine trade has not disappeared, and new networks continue to spring up, evolving in response to crackdowns. Yet, Medellín's transformation became a global symbol of hope, showing how a city once ravaged by violence could rise from its darkest days. Escobar's family also faced a lifetime in his shadow. His wife, Maria Victoria Henao, and their children, who had changed their names to avoid the stigma of his legacy, sought refuge abroad but were continuously haunted by their connection to El Patron. His son, Juan Pablo Escobar, who took the name Sebastián Marroquín, later published a memoir, grappling with his father's contradictory image as both a devoted family man and ruthless drug lord. Through Marroquín's story, we see a child's journey to reckon with a legacy that shaped his life, but also cast a dark shadow over his future. Escobar's wife and children tried to lead quiet lives, yet they would forever be marked by his name. Meanwhile, Escobar's legacy of violence and corruption reverberated beyond Colombia. Drug trafficking routes evolved, moving north into Mexico, where the drug trade continued to grow, ushering in an era of deadly cartel conflicts that would ravage Mexico and leave tens of thousands dead. Escobar's methods of bribery, intimidation, and raw violence set a precedent that influenced the tactics used by future drug lords, particularly the Mexican cartels, who would go on to establish some of the most violent criminal networks in modern history. Today, Pablo Escobar remains a controversial figure. To some, especially those who benefited from his Robin Hood-style philanthropy, he is remembered as a folk hero, a man who stood up to authority and shared his wealth with the poor. But for the many Colombians who lost loved ones or lived in terror during his reign, he is seen as nothing more than a ruthless criminal, a man who plunged an entire nation into chaos and bloodshed. Escobar's story also became a global cultural phenomenon. His life has been immortalized in films, books, and popular television series like Narcos, captivating audiences with tales of a man who defied governments and lived by his own set of brutal rules. This fascination has sparked a debate over the potential glamorization of his life, as some worry that depictions of Escobar risk romanticizing his actions or presenting him as a larger-than-life anti-hero. Yet for those who look deeper, the story of Pablo Escobar is a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition, the corrosive power of money, and the lasting scars left on a nation and its people. Today, Medellín is a city reborn, a place of progress and innovation, a place that has sought to redefine itself and move forward from its violent past. Parks and public spaces have replaced cartel strongholds, and the city's people have embraced a new spirit of resilience and community. But Escobar's impact on Colombia and the world at large is not easily erased. His life and the legacy of his empire remain as both a reminder of the power one individual can wield over a nation and a testament to the possibility of recovery and renewal in even the darkest of circumstances. Through it all, Escobar's story prompts questions that continue to resonate. What is the true cost of power? How much is a man willing to sacrifice, and how many lives is he willing to take to achieve his version of success? And perhaps most importantly, can a society plagued by violence and corruption truly find peace and redemption? In Colombia's case, the answer lies not in forgetting the past, but in confronting it head-on, learning from it, and ensuring that it never repeats itself. After Escobar's death, Colombia began the difficult process of rebuilding from the devastation left by his legacy. While Medellín's transformation from the most dangerous city in the world to a beacon of urban revitalization stands as a remarkable success, the remnants of Escobar's cartel, as well as new criminal factions, continued to plague the country for decades. His influence lingered as other groups rose from the rubble of his empire, each fighting for control of Colombia's lucrative cocaine routes. This evolving landscape of organized crime brought its own challenges, forcing Colombia to reckon with a new generation of cartel violence. The Cali Cartel, once an ally and later a fierce rival to Escobar, quickly seized power in the vacuum left by his death. Unlike the Medellín Cartel's high-profile tactics, the Cali Cartel operated with a quieter, more business-oriented approach. Led by the Orejuela brothers, they leaned into a corporate style of cartel management, relying on bribery and strategic alliances over open warfare. Yet, despite their more discreet methods, their cartel was equally ruthless, and it soon controlled up to 90% of the global cocaine market, making it even more powerful than Escobar's cartel at its height. For a time, this shift from Medellín's violence to Cali's more covert tactics allowed the Colombian government some breathing room. Authorities turned their focus on dismantling the Cali cartel and eventually succeeded by the mid-1990s. But as one cartel fell, others rose. The North Valley Cartel, followed by smaller factions and bandas criminales, filled the gaps, adapting to survive in an increasingly militarized and monitored environment. These new groups evolved with the times, leveraging advanced technologies and diversifying into human trafficking, illegal mining, and other forms of organized crime. Beyond Colombia, Escobar's influence had a profound impact on the global drug trade, particularly as trafficking routes shifted northward to Mexico. Mexican cartels, particularly the Sinaloa cartel, began to dominate as they forged strong ties with Colombian suppliers and effectively replaced the Caribbean routes that Escobar had once controlled. Leaders like Joaquin El Chapo Guzman observed and replicated Escobar's methods of terror and corruption, yet they refined them, creating vast criminal networks across North America. The violence and cartel influence Escobar unleashed had permanently altered the U.S.-Colombian relationship. The United States, which had a significant stake in curbing the cocaine influx, implemented Plan Colombia, an ambitious and controversial aid package designed to combat drug trafficking at its source. This initiative provided billions of dollars in military and economic aid, significantly bolstering Colombia's ability to fight cartels and maintain internal security. Though controversial, it did help Colombia improve its security infrastructure, enabling the government to regain control over much of the country. Medellín itself, while healing from Escobar's reign, continues to grapple with his legacy. His infamous Hacienda Nápoles has been transformed into a theme park, a tangible symbol of Medellín's desire to reclaim and repurpose the symbols of its darkest days. Visitors can walk through the grounds, observing both the grandeur and absurdity of Escobar's lifestyle, including the hippos that now roam freely, a peculiar remnant of his estate's imported wildlife. Despite the violence he unleashed, Escobar's image remains divisive. His story has become a cultural fascination, particularly for audiences outside Colombia. Television series, films, and books have captivated audiences with his life story, transforming Escobar into a near-mythical figure. His narrative has been woven into everything from popular Netflix series to hip-hop lyrics, a phenomenon that has both perplexed and angered many Colombians who lived through his terror. Some worry that these portrayals glamorize his lifestyle or depict him as an anti-hero, ignoring the suffering he caused to countless families and communities across Colombia. Yet, within Colombia, the memory of Escobar is treated with far more complexity. He remains both a cautionary tale and a symbol of the devastating consequences of unchecked power. His story is one that Colombians recount not for entertainment, but as a warning, a reminder of a time when their country was nearly torn apart by a man who believed he was above the law. Colombian schools have integrated lessons on Escobar and the cartels into history and ethics courses, ensuring that future generations understand the consequences of his actions and the nation's resilience in rebuilding from it. In Medellín's poorer neighborhoods, where Escobar's charitable projects once won him support, community leaders now work tirelessly to promote real, sustainable change. Local organizations focus on providing legitimate paths to prosperity for Medellín's youth, offering education, sports programs, and job training to ensure that future generations have opportunities beyond the pull of organized crime. These grassroots efforts reflect Medellín's commitment to breaking the cycle of violence and poverty that allowed Escobar's cartel to thrive in the first place. In the end, Pablo Escobar's life left an indelible mark on Colombia and the world. His rise and fall reshaped the landscape of global crime, changed the U.S.-Colombian relationship, and fueled a decades-long conversation about the ethics of wealth, power, and influence. Escobar's story serves as a stark reminder of the devastating impact one individual can have on a nation, and the tremendous resilience required to overcome it. Through Medellín's remarkable transformation, Colombia has demonstrated that even the darkest chapters can be rewritten. The legacy of Escobar's empire remains a part of history, but Colombia's story, led by those who endured his reign, is one of recovery, resilience, and the determination to forge a future free from the shadows of its past. And so, the story of Pablo Escobar, the man who rose from Medellín's slums to control one of the world's most feared empires, comes to an end. Escobar's reign was marked by extremes, a twisted legacy of wealth, violence, and an unwavering quest for power that brought both Colombia and himself to a brutal reckoning. But beyond the violence, Escobar's life reflects deeper questions. His self-styled role as a Robin Hood sparked mixed feelings among those he left behind. To some, he was a ruthless killer. To others, he was the only force that brought attention and resources to Medellin's poorest communities. His legacy lives on, not just in the country he altered, but in the hippos now thriving in Colombia's rivers and in the minds of those who still argue. Was he a ruthless criminal or a reluctant hero? What do you think? Drop us a comment with your thoughts on Escobar's story, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more stories from the shadows of history. This is Bytes. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.